The new series that we are moving into is one that I've called Deep Joy. We will be exploring joy, not happiness that seems to depend on situation, but true joy that doesn't depend on our circumstance. Where does joy come from? How do we access it? As I've been working on this series, I've been engaging with the Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, two men who have experienced great challenge and suffering, and yet who embody profound joy and peace. The author of the book, Douglas Abrams, gathered these two men together for an interview so that he could witness and share this conversation about joy. Now, he had many questions of his own that he wanted to ask these two men, but he also opened it up and asked people what kind of questions did they have about joy that they wanted to ask. He received many submissions of questions. The question theme that most often occurred was, is it okay to be joyful? Or how can I be joyful when I see so much suffering in the world? I found it interesting that this question was the most asked because it's a question that deeply resonates with me right now. I think throughout the season of quarantine and the reckoning with the true breadth and depth of racial injustice in our nation, I have found myself wondering that too. Perhaps it's guilt, but if I'm honest, sometimes I have this feeling that nags. Is it okay to be joyful when I'm witnessing pain and loss and suffering of others? And it seems I'm not alone in wrestling with this. Now, I do truly believe that joy is an act of resistance. When we are personally or collectively facing something that threatens to suck the life force out of us, it is an act of resistance to claim joyfulness even in the face of our struggles. When I look at my own personal story, claiming joy in difficult times, my mind immediately goes back to the aftermath of my diagnosis with MS. Because that is where my story hinges, at least in the way that I tell it. Somehow, and I do believe that this was a profound gift of the Spirit, I found the strength to stare my disease in the face and proclaim that this thing isn't going to take me down. The disease could potentially take many things away from me, things which I had no control over, and I couldn't predict what they would be. I had no way of knowing what was coming next. But through the gift of the Spirit, I found the strength to say that whatever this disease would take from me, the one thing that it couldn't take from me is my joy. And I found such power in looking my disease in the face and saying, "You can't have this." Joy runs deep, and this joy is mine to be claimed. Perhaps you have an experience in your life of digging down into those deep wells of joy that come from somewhere rooted so deeply inside. I think it's really beautiful when we look at artwork and music and all kinds of creative things that come from communities on the margins all across the globe. We often find some of the most colorful, the most vibrant, the most joyful designs and sounds in the world. Last week we explored Psalm 137, a heartbreaking psalm of loss and grief and exile, of these exiles who were being taunted by their captors, asked to sing songs when all the while they were just grieving, and they were afraid that perhaps they had left their songs behind in Jerusalem, a city that lie in ruins. We asked, how can we sing in times of great loss and grief, hardship and injustice? One of the most curious things and hopeful things that I've discovered when studying the Hebrew Bible, which, as we know, is full of a whole range of writings. Some of it's violent, some of it portrays a judging, punishing God. There's a lot of difficult, scary stuff mixed in with some incredibly beautiful, hopeful stuff. But it's interesting to me that some of the most hopeful and the most joyful writings in the entire Hebrew Bible were written during the exile. They didn't come from the times when the Israelites were on the top of their game. It seems a little counterintuitive. It didn't happen when they were building palaces or and their temple, or when they were united and ruling themselves. But rather, after they had lost everything, from that space is where some of the most hopeful and joyful writings emerge. Today we're going to read from Genesis 1, the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible. Starts with the creation story written during exile by exiles, by those who had experienced firsthand violence and destruction that could have shaken their faith in the goodness of creation, shaken their faith in the very goodness of God. These are the same people who had hung up their instruments, just sure that there could never, ever be another song in their heart. But the words of Genesis 1 seem like they found a way to sing a new song. They looked out at the world in which they found themselves captive. And still, even from this place, they saw something good. I'm going to read from Genesis 1, 1 through 5. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape and form. It was dark over the deep sea, and God's wind swept over the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and light appeared. God saw how good the light was. God separated the light from the darkness. God named the light day and the darkness night. There was evening and there was morning, the first day. As Genesis 1 goes on, this pattern repeats. God speaks, creation forms. God sees good. God spoke and separated the water from the sky, the dry land from the sea. God spoke and filled the earth with vegetation of all kinds. God spoke and divided the day from the night. God spoke into creation the animals of the sea, the birds of the air, the livestock, all kinds of wildlife. This is a vision of abundance, everything blessed to be fruitful and multiply. Human beings created in the divine image to be stewards of all of this beautiful abundance. And all along, at every step of the way, God saw good. Genesis says God spoke, and that's what happened. God saw everything God had made. It was supremely good. I love how the Common English Bible translation begins with "when God began to create." Perhaps because it disrupts the language that we are familiar with, "in the beginning." "In the beginning" is an English translation that originally stemmed from the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And this provides us with one way of reading and understanding this phrase. But I've been intrigued to learn that it is not a literal translation of the Hebrew, or even the only way that we can engage and approach this passage. When God began to create is perhaps more in tune with the Hebrew. We hear "in the beginning," and it sounds very solid and certain, and yet the Hebrew is more expansive. It offers lots more interpretive space. In her book, Womanist Midrash, Wilda Gaffney points out that the first Hebrew word in the Bible is most literally translated in beginning, or in a beginning, or even when beginning, which is so beautiful. Gaffney invites us to ponder that a beginning gestures to a spiraling creation and its stories, and to multiple contextual ways of hearing, imagining, and retelling these stories. This is a life-giving way of engaging the creation story for exiles who are trying to make sense of their circumstance and their hopes and their dreams for a future. And it is also a life-giving way for us to engage our own stories as well. God spoke creation into being, order and beauty shaped out of chaos, and God saw it was good. And not just good, but good, 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 supremely good. What an act of faith it is to rejoice in creation in this way from exile. Created beings are good. God is good. Creation is generated through speech. God says it, and it is so. And this is amazingly hopeful for a community of storytellers whose identity has been forged and passed through the generations through active memory. I'll admit, I've kind of geeked out on words this week. One of the sad things about reading the Hebrew Bible in English is that we miss out on a lot of nuance. There are so many little things, connections that are made when two words that are different but look very similar, or certain rhythms or humor, things that are both visual and auditory that add layers of things that we miss when we read it in English. Little things that are lost in translation. The refrain that is repeated in this creation narrative, and God saw it was good, or as the CEB version says, God saw how good it was, is such a beautiful little piece of this passage, and it's repeated many times. So just in case we missed it the first time, it comes back and it reminds us, lest we forget, it reminds us again. In the book Grammar of God, by Avia Kushner, I discovered that I had been missing out on a little hidden magic in the original Hebrew words of this passage. In Hebrew, the phrase that has been translated, and God saw it was good, is Vayer Elohim Kitav. In English, the word and is just a simple little word, a conjunction that joins two things together. But in Hebrew, what is translated as and is represented by one tiny little letter that is tacked to the front of the word that it follows. And just a little bit like a magic wand, this little letter seems to have the power to change the tense of the word to which it is attached. Kushner explains that in the Hebrew, the word and he saw begins with this peculiar little letter, which makes it an unusual mixture of past and future tense. The root word, he will see, is a future tense word. And when you add this tiny little letter to it, it becomes a verb in past tense. So Kushner says the resulting verb lives in a special zone of biblical time, a past tense that lies in the foundation of a verb in future tense. This was a wow for me this week. I think that's incredibly beautiful. If this very good creation was a beginning, could God not begin again in our own stories? This past future tense of seeing goodness seems to suggest yes. Rejoice, because the sun still shines. Day comes after the night, marking events, sacred seasons, weeks, and years. The sun still shines. It is still good. God is still the God who brought order and beauty out of the primordial depths. God is still a God that liberates, and the Spirit is one that creates out of goodness out of chaos, then and now and into the future. What a reason to be joyful. Of course, then what if we return to that first question where we started? How can we be joyful when there is so much suffering around us? The Archbishop Desmond Tutu answered this way. God created us and said, "Go now, my child. You have freedom." And God has such an incredible reverence for that freedom that God would much rather we went freely to hell than compel us to come to heaven. Yes, we're capable of the most awful atrocities. We can give a catalog, and God weeps until there are those who say, "I do want to try to do something." It is good also to remember that we have a fantastic capacity for goodness. And then you look again, and you see those doctors and nurses from other parts of the world who go into those situations. I mean, why do they go there? I mean, they could stay in France or wherever and have a wonderful practice, but they don't. They go off to some of the most poverty-stricken places. You've seen it with Ebola. People go into hugely dangerous situations, coming from countries where they don't have Ebola, and they have no reason to go to Sierra Leone or wherever. They are just showing us what we are all capable of being. And by proxy, we link ourselves to those and we try as much as we can to enter into who we are. People of compassion. What can we do to help the situation? You might not be able to do a great deal, but start where you are and do what you can where you are. And yes, be appalled. It would be awful if we looked at all of the horrendousness and we said, it doesn't really matter. It is so wonderful that we can be distressed. That is part of the greatness of who we are. That you are distressed about someone who is not your family in any conventional way, and yet you feel distressed equally. It is incredible just how compassionate and generous people can be. Perhaps that is what being created in the image of God is about. The deepest parts of us draw us toward others and call us to engage the world with compassion, love, and mercy. While witnessing atrocities, while having our eyes open to injustice, sorrow and anger stir up within us, and that has its roots in empathy and compassion and caring for our fellow human beings. This is a part of what is so good about creation. And this goodness calls us toward joy. While we can witness that humanity has the capacity to destroy and oppress, we also witness the capacity for great compassion and love. And acting on compassion and love brings us joy. So not only is it okay, but it is true and good to be joyful even though there is suffering and injustice in the world. The beauty is joy is not a zero-sum game. Joy is a gift of the Spirit, and abundance is the centerpiece of the creation narrative. Multiplication is God's math. So rejoice. I'm so thankful for the poets and the artists that help us to bring form and shape to the chaos around us, that help us to make space for the both and complexities of paradox. This week in our Tuesday book group, Jim shared a poem by Mary Oliver entitled Don't Hesitate. And wow, how this resonated in my pondering this week. What joy there is to be found as the artists and poets of the world bless us on the journey of meaning making. I'm going to close my message today by sharing Mary Oliver's poem, Don't Hesitate. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give into it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb.